thrilled to welcome Stephen Markley. I've loved this guy's novels, and I am really excited to share them with you this evening. Stephen is author of the novel Ohio, a memoir called Publish This Book, as well as a travelogue called Tales of Iceland. He's a graduate of Iowa Writers Workshop. He is also a graduate of Miami, Ohio. I think you're missing their football game right now, too. So, yeah, that's sweet action. Anyway, and he is here to talk tonight about his new book, The Deluge. Just came out in paperback. We're really excited about it. You can read wonderful reviews of this book all over the place, but let me give you one maybe you can't read in any newspaper. It's my little write-up of the book. And I say about it, this book is written like a rising ocean, wave after wave of moments and years and ideas crashing one after the other, relentlessly eroding the shores. An epic novel peopled with characters as real as any person you know. It will fill you up with hope and heartbreak. This is a feast of a book. So please give Stephen a warm welcome.
How's that? Good? All right, I'm just going to read a quick excerpt, and then we'll proceed from there. Okay. So this quick little piece is from a Vanity Fair article that will be written in 2026. It's called Chaos and the Planet's Last Stand. Once an anonymous foot soldier in an underfunded climate justice group, Kate Morris and a fierce blue fire defied party politics, upended the midterm elections, and have reignited momentum on the climate crisis. Moniza Faruqi profiles the frank, funny, fearless woman who has stormed to the front of the movement, even though she may not be welcome there. And then cutting to the middle of the article, this is Kate is in Phoenix, and this is her presentation. She's the head of a group called A Fierce Blue Fire, and she's sort of barnstorming the country after the midterms. Now, I'm sorry to say, that's probably our last laugh for the evening, she says, and the crowd whispers itself to silence. She turns to the screen. So here is my whole presentation. Soak it up. The logo behind her switches to 430 ppm. I'm not telling you anything new. That is the carbon dioxide level of the atmosphere today. We started at around 280 before the Industrial Revolution. We know the absolute safe upper threshold is 350, which the world blew by in the 90s, and it's still rising at the rate of 2 to 3 parts per million every year. It's as simple as this. The fate of every man, woman, child, and species on this planet is bound to this number. Nothing matters unless we can stop and eventually reverse that number. She steps back from the podium and decides to pull her hair into a bun, swiftly snatching a hair tie from her wrist and running her hand over her face to collect loose strands as she speaks. She gives a quick lesson in the basic physics and chemistry of greenhouse gas emissions, simple enough that when Svante Arrhenius made a few back-of-the-envelope calculations in 1896, he predicted that if smokestacks continued to belch CO2, the planet would eventually warm by 3 to 6 degrees centigrade. This remains exactly in line with what the most sophisticated computer models still say today. What most scientists have been wrong about, Morris continues, is how quickly our planet's systems could unravel given this additional heat. The chaos we're seeing is from just a 1.2 degree temperature rise. Now we have feedback loops to fear. Her hands make swift, enormous gesticulations, a conductor building urgency for her symphony, as she describes the Amazon's epic droughts releasing 6 billion tons of CO2, equivalent to annual U.S. emissions. She moves on to the permafrost in the tundra of Alaska, northern Canada, and Siberia. Finally, she describes the deposits of methane throughout the world's oceans. Scientists hoped it would take centuries for methane clathrates to melt, but they're already discovering plumes venting from the Arctic Ocean during sea ice retreats. The first ice-free Arctic summer will probably arrive in the next 5 to 10 years, and rather than white ice reflecting sunlight, the dark ocean absorbs it. Yet another feedback loop imperiling the highly dangerous clathrates. For anyone who hasn't read Anthony Pietrus's terrifying book, she goes on, at that point, there is no adaptation, no survival, no Earth. The entire surface of the planet will be too hot to sustain life. So we're not just talking about fucking polar bears here. We're talking about the violent disintegration of civilization, followed by a slow-rolling global genocide, and it's underway right now. In other words, it might already be too late. Here is the absolute best-case scenario of where we are. She leaves the podium and approaches the edge of the stage. She stops with her toes on the precipice and leans forward, outstretched arms quivering in tight, tiny circles for balance. She teeters forward impossibly far, and one can easily picture her sprawling face first into the front row, cracking her chin open or worse. There's a palpable anxiety to watching her perform this feat, the crowd tensing at this gut-clenching display, the spotlight spilling her long shadow across the stage. 2,000 mouths exhale with relief when she finally catches hold of her momentum and tilts back from the edge. She smiles at herself and returns to the podium. Again, that is our best case scenario. We have a precious handful of years left to act, and I promise you this. If you do not join this movement now, you will wake up 10, 15, 20 years from now and feel sick that you didn't do everything you could during the sliver of time when we still had a chance, when we hadn't yet fallen over the brink. I've heard this speech multiple times by now, but there is something acute about the blanket silence that engulfs this crowd. Morris checks her notebook on the lectern. So what does that mean? First of all, forget about your carbon footprint. Carbon footprint is a PR term invented by an oil company. I want you to remember 2 words. These words replace 430 behind her. They knew. They are the carbon majors, the 100 companies responsible for over 70% of emissions since the 80s. Their own scientists knew what would happen. They knew if they kept burning their reserves, they would threaten the future of the human race. They knew, and they built their oil rigs to account for higher sea levels and more intense storms. They knew, and they told us to focus on our consumer behavior while they locked us all into structures of hyperconsumption. They knew, and they waged a propaganda war of denial and delay. They knew, and they're still doing it. There is no other way to put it. They are committing the greatest atrocity in human history, and they knew. They knew, and they told us to worry about our fucking carbon footprints. And I'll stop there.
It is a scary book.
Just a little light kickoff to a
Yeah,
nice beach
it
read.
is a scary book. Something we always like to start with the reading, and you're in TV writing, so you know what's the elevator pitch. What is just the 30-second in case anyone doesn't know.
I sort of say it's a near future epic of the climate crisis. It spans 40 years, starting in 2013 in our recent recognizable past, and moves into the near future up until 2040. And it's sort of my version of what it will feel like to live inside a climate model. Like we can see what's coming, we understand the physics and chemistry of it, but what will it feel like emotionally to actually live through it? That's sort of the purpose of the novel, and it uses a range of characters to sort of create that emotional experience.
Yeah, and you've been working on this book for more than a decade, right?
Yeah, since I think I wrote the first part of it in 2010.
All right, so I love the elevator pitch. You nailed it. But what, like, in that more than decade, you had to have some elevator pitches or thought, like, this book is definitely about this, that now you're like, nope, wasn't about that.
I don't know, not really.
Okay.
I sort of started off with the thought, like, I'm going to write a book about the most important thing to happen in my lifetime, and probably in the lifetime of anybody alive right now, which is the climate crisis. And I sort of saw early on the dimensions of it, and as a kid, a college kid who was trying to become a writer, this was something I wanted to try to tackle. And it just happened to be this incredibly difficult and immense subject that required a lot of thinking about how you translate that into story, into narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm interested too, because obviously this has been hanging, we're about the same age, this has been hanging over our heads since we were born. And I think the central question of the book, how bad does this get, before we collectively decide to do something about it. But what was your moment when you personally were like, kind of became conscious of the problem, kind of were like, oh, wow, this is really bad?
Well, I mean, I always think it's like easy to understand abstractly that this is really bad. Like that's sort of simple enough. I think there were probably a few books in there that really began to freak me out. And particularly the work of James Hansen, who was a NASA scientist who sort of first brought global warming to the world's attention in 1988 when he testified before Congress. And he has been sort of this indefatigable, not anybody who's going to easily break through on Seth Meyers with like a hit, bit. He's like just a very staid, sort of normal Iowan who happened to go into studying Venus, and then was like looking at the atmospheric composition of Venus and all the carbon in the atmosphere and how it was a fried planet, and basically said, oh no,
Wait a minute.
what's gonna happen when we do this, right? And so I think some of his writings and some of the like sort of the simple ways he put the problem really informed me and sort of would later inform a character in the book who is Tony.
Yeah, absolutely. The reading too, I know how to pronounce Tony's last name now, so that was helpful. Thank you. Speaking of the characters, so there's six storylines you follow through the book, and each one is focused on a different central character, a different set of characters. And if you've read this, you know, like I kind of wanted a family tree at the beginning of the book. But can you give us maybe just a quick intro to each character so we know like who we're going to journey with?
Yeah, I mean, I'll super quick. There's
Right.
Kate, an activist. Can't even remember the fucking characters in my own book. Tony, a scientist.
I have
Ash
my
is a
cheat sheet
mathematician. Who else? Jackie works for a PR firm. Keeper is a drug addict in Ohio, whose story we sort of figure out how it connects. I think that's it.
Oh, and it's Sheer. Did you say it's Sheer?
Yeah, I think I
Okay. Shows how much I'm listening. I love the writer question and the writer thing too. Of course, there's always the quote, there's a piece of me in every one of my characters, of course. But is there somebody in the book that you're kind of more in love with than the others?
I mean, I think like all the central characters you're sort of trying to treat as your equal children. And of course, like there's one kid is like he's best, right? Or she. But obviously Kate is sort of the sun around which the solar system of the book rotates, right? And it's sort of like we watch the fictional world of the book bend around this woman who is so full of so much conviction that she both pushes change ahead while also sort of terrorizing the people who care about her, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I kind of love, we see Kate a lot through her kind of partner for a while. I don't want to give anything away, but we see her through his eyes a whole lot. And I kind of love just from a crafty perspective. I think we've got some writers out there, so we'll do a little crafty stuff. But yeah, kind of staring at her because she is such a forceful character throughout this whole book. Yeah. Speaking of the character you brought up, Keeper, the Ohio drug addict, and there are multiple characters who reflect me in your first novel in Ohio too. Character in this book, I remember there's just an unforgettable scene in the Deluge of Keeper going to try and sell plasma, which if you've ever sold plasma, it's not something you want to do multiple times. But yeah, what draws you to writing about kind of Ohio dirtbags?
Well, I mean, I think like with any character, you are, no matter how bad their behavior, how unpleasant their actions, you are searching for their humanity. And Keeper's journey is largely about him rediscovering his own humanity. And so you meet him in like a really like terrible moment in his life when he's done something horrible. You progress with him as he sort of hits absolute rock bottom in terms of addiction, in terms of his criminality. And then, his story takes a turn. And I won't reveal more than that, but just to say that, like, Keeper was a character who I understood from the beginning, plot-wise, why he was going to be in the book, but didn't really understand what his sort of emotional arc was going to be. And that was one of the pleasures, is that you're discovering that emotional arc as you write and finding much more humanity in the character than you would have expected to begin with. I just read this thing George Saunders, the author, was saying that like when an author sits down to write, they are a better version of themselves, hopefully, if they're doing it right. And I frequently like find myself like judging people in my real life and being pissed off and being angry about how dumb people are, and it's like, it's so frustrating. But when I'm like writing a character, it's all I'm doing is like thinking about how they operate and why they operate and what has happened to them in their lives that has led them to this place. And it's just like one of the joys of being a writer, of exploring fiction, is that you are that better version of yourself and sort of like looking for this common thread of humanity with people you otherwise would in real life judge and feel like we're dirtbags or we're pieces of shit, whatever it might be.
Yep, absolutely. I think too some of the really powerful moments in this book come from exactly what you're talking about, where you're dealing with the biggest external forces, literally the existential global crisis. But at the same time, I think the really powerful moments are these very quiet, intimate moments throughout the book between one or two characters. Um, but at the same time, that pressure of everything that's going on is coming through that. How did you balance that? How are you balancing as you're writing the deeply personal with this huge global crisis?
Well, I mean, if there's a sort of a thread that runs through both Ohio and the Deluge, it's that they're both about these enormous external forces, these big movements in our country and on our planet, but seen through the lens of individuals who have to live through them, who have to bear the weight of them. So in Ohio, there's Dan, who's an Afghan and Iraq war vet, and so we're understanding that major foreign policy catastrophe through the eyes of this one individual, right? And similarly, the climate crisis. Like, I wanted a lens on it from the perspectives of all these different characters coming at it from different angles, but also I knew I needed that one character who not only doesn't believe in climate change, but doesn't care, doesn't think it affects him, doesn't want anything to do with it, and is sort of like outside of its, of even conceiving about it, right, in his day-to-day life. And yet he lives on planet Earth, so it is affecting him nonetheless. And so the project of Keeper was sort of see how, he moved through this world I was creating, even as he was not, sort of acknowledging any of this around him.
Beyond the characters, though, you spent, like I said, a decade writing this. You touched on this a little bit before, but what did the research over the years look like going into this book? Because there's a wealth of scientific information in the book. Yeah, what did that look like over the years as you were writing it and as things were changing while you were writing it?
Yeah, I mean, it was hard. You're trying to understand this just insanely complex issue from as many angles as possible. And it was basically, nonstop reading, nonstop bugging people to see if I could talk to them, nonstop sort of reassessing what I even thought about certain elements of the crisis. And you never really stop learning about it. And I think, like, one of the most difficult parts was that climate, not only like in terms of like the acceleration of how scary it's getting, but the political sort of valence of it has changed a lot in the 10 years it took me to write this book. So just as an example, I turned in what's called fourth pass, which is sort of your last draft, your last opportunity to change anything before your publisher is sending it to the printer. I turned that in right as Joe Manchin had said, like, we're not doing this climate bill, never mind, right? And so, of course, I was like, well, I'm weeping for humanity and this is devastating, et cetera, but at least my book will make sense. So thanks, Joe Manchin, right? And then, of course, like a few weeks later, he changed his mind. They passed this enormous bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is like the biggest climate policy bill pretty much ever enacted in the history of the world. And I was like, oh, well, this fucks up my book, but I guess like I'm crying tears of joy because we have a fighting chance at saving the world. And so it was that sort of conflict of trying to get the what I call the teeth of the zipper to meet, because it's all the problems of publishing a 1,000-page epic novel combined with the problems of it has to meet the moment of its publication and feel relevant politically, economically, socially, culturally.
The political becomes personal for Markley too. One thing I think that's interesting as you're writing this and that you're grappling with that might be even more difficult than like meeting the moment, as you're saying, is you play futurist quite a bit in this book. We do get to go forward a bit. Virtual reality kind of is an extension of our life on the internet. I'm curious, what's the most, so as playing futurist, because that had to be kind of fun, right?
Yeah, sure, of course.
What's maybe something you're like most adamant, like this is definitely going to happen?
Well, I mean, it's already all happened, so I'm sort of like behind. What
Right.
I'm in a writer's room right now, and Chat GPT came out and just scared the shit out of everyone in Hollywood. And obviously the book is full of AI writing news stories and books and all this other stuff. Like it's a huge factor. And at the time, I remember people who were reading my book were like, this seems a little far-fetched. Now it don't seem so far-fetched, right? And so that has been like the whole experience of writing the novel is just like things coming true faster than I could get it to publication, which bodes not great for a lot of stuff. But it's mostly just about looking at trends, right? So like you're looking at trends of the climate crisis. You're looking at trends of technology, and you're just making educated guesses. So, in the book, it's virtual reality has sort of replaced our phones as like the all-purpose widget that is like despoiling our brains and making us all insane. And it's just sort of like looking at the evolution of surveillance capitalism and how much more it will invade our cognition and invade our psychology and invade our relationships. And sort of predicting a terrifying future in that regard too. So
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing that doesn't change though is there's still lunatics using whatever device they can to get close to you. So the prophet, and
sure.
yeah. So I mean, what do you think's not going to change? What's absolutely staying the same?
What do you mean?
From now going forward? I suppose being the futurist in the same kind of sense.
I guess I don't understand the question.
Perhaps I don't either.
Okay.
We'll skip it. We'll move on. Something I love in the book, a phrase that comes up a couple of times, is political imagination.
Yeah.
And when thinking about what's possible, I particularly, there's one character's berating another's lack of political imagination. Just what is political imagination to you?
Well, the old saw of the Overton window of what we think is possible. I think like the book was started in a time when a lot more seemed possible. I'll say than when it was published,
Sure.
right? And now we all feel like this very like foreclosed sense of where we're headed. I feel like, and it's been very dark and grim for a while. And I think just making sure one is keeping open the possibility that like a radical new world that is more just and more secure and more sustainable is always at hand. It's always close. It's just a matter of, can we pull the levers and push the buttons of our democracy in order to achieve that. And that's really all it is.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it seems like writing this book is a hope that you can both explore that and expand some readers' political imagination, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think like, there's a big section in the last, sort of the last part where it's just like, okay, we're in the middle of this crisis, and one of the, sort of a very direct character, Asher Alassane, is sort of laying out like, okay, here's what we're gonna do, right? And that was a really fun part to write because I set in motion this epic crisis in the novel, culminated in an economic crisis caused by climate change. And I just sort of like, after I'd scared the living fuck out of myself, just had to sort of sit back and be like, okay, well, what exactly would we do if this happened, right? Like, what would we have to, what laws would we have to pass to bring our country and our planet back from the brink? And at that point, I got to explore that question with a lot of very smart individuals and a lot of interesting papers and books, and sort of craft this piece of legislation that would forestall that crisis. And I just think giving the reader an idea that this is possible is sort of one of the projects of the book.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in writing it, did it expand your own idea of what's possible, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say after, I got 4/5 of the way done and was just staring at the ceiling every night, just, scaring myself silly all the time and feeling dread and anxiety and grief and all that. But, doing that last part sort of gave me this new lens on what we have to do, which is, this is very like the basketball coach in me, but like, stop whining and start doing the work. You know what I mean? Like,
Totally.
like the idea of hope versus despair is useless. Work is what matters.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mentioned the pastor before. Maybe a couple words on who the pastor is.
What?
The pastor?
He is a the next iteration of fascism in the book. Like the next like very scary person who's going to utilize a technology to sort of work his way quickly up the political ladder and possibly to the presidency. No spoilers.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a zealot, a fascist zealot, absolutely. Very much a religious fascist. I'm fascinated with how you write people with idealistic extremes, particularly him as an example. What makes you interested in that?
In the extremes of his politics, or like what?
Just writing characters in general with the idealistic extremes. But yeah, him in particular.
Well, I mean, look, it's just like the most obvious thing about the climate crisis is that it's going to produce reactionary politics, right? Like, one of the things that I think has been a very foolish idea that sort of floated around for a while is that, well, things will get bad enough and people will wake up. But it's actually the opposite. I think that is going to happen. The worse these storms, droughts, fires, rising sea levels, the worse these effects of weather and climate get, the more terrified people are, the more they're going to look for that white knight on a horse with a sword who says he can make everything, probably he, but not always possibly she, is going to make everything better, right? And the book, is fully immersed in, setting up a range of characters who could fulfill that promise, and then sort of guessing at what iteration will come out of this sort of like frothing mess of terrifying politics. And I think that has been, like, for me, a really scary part of this, because like I was sort of coming up with this angle in 2011-ish, 2012, when it was in the ether, but not nearly as immediate as it feels now. And just to watch the way that set of politics has risen around the world so quickly is really something else. And certainly the migrant crisis in Europe, that is the perfect example of sort of weather-related disasters on top of many other issues, pushing people from North Africa, from the Middle East into Europe, and setting off a chain reaction that suddenly you have a lot of people talking about stuff that didn't seem possible 5 years earlier. And so I think that's what's scary, is just how quickly our politics can turn into something we don't recognize.
Absolutely. And the shift in the language over the last few years has been pretty horrifying too, for sure. Speaking of language throughout the book, I think it's fascinating. The language of war comes up again and again and again in the book. And I think almost every character, except maybe Keeper, says, like, this is a war we're in. We're fighting a war about the effort to stop climate change. I'm really curious about how you approach that. Do you think that's a necessary outlook to tackle the problem, or perhaps were you writing it as just an extension of how in America we're just really good at war, and so that's kind of how we approach things?
Well, I think there is an element of, this, it's an easy metaphor to reach for. But also I think there's a lot of truth to that as well. And I'll explain that a little bit more. A lot, sort of with Green New Deal politics, it's this idea that, like, we're going to, like, using the New Deal as a template, that we're going to create jobs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But really, like, from a technical perspective, what we have to do is build an immense amount of stuff super quickly. And the best analogy for that in history is World War II, when, the government of the United States basically took over the economy and said, we have to produce X number of tanks, guns, and bombs to beat the fascists in Europe, right? That is kind of similar to what we have to do now. We really should be building solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, every other technology we need. I could list them all, but that would be boring. And we have to do it so quickly. And I think, like, that is one of the things that is so vital to keep in mind, is that it's not just that we have to do it, it's the speed with which we have to do it. Mm-hmm. And so really the only historical analogy to any country doing that is World War II. And I think the Inflation Reduction Act is absolutely a down payment on that sort of necessity, right? It's about trying to build as much of this stuff as possible and onshoring a lot of it to the US so that it's creating jobs, which sort of combines that New Deal component. It's coming into particularly the industrial Midwest, which saw a lot of flight of industry in this last part of the 20th century, and hopefully will, like, reignite a sort of political realignment around those industries, right? So it's not just about building the stuff, it's about getting people on board with the process of decarbonization who otherwise wouldn't be, particularly in states where I'm from, like Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, et cetera, Wisconsin, of course. I had to look at the back of my guitar to make sure I knew where I was.
All good. Something too, working at odds against those things, though, is something you grapple with in the book, is political violence, sabotage, terrorism. And I mean, political violence is something all of your work has been grappling with from all ends of the spectrum. I think there are debates in the book, and I think you go really deep and particularly try to find this moment where these characters, where violence, where terror becomes okay. Yeah. Right, where that becomes okay to the characters, like, or the right response to what they see as an existential threat. Tell me about writing that. Tell me about going into that space.
I mean, obviously you are trying to, when you're writing from a character's perspective, you're trying to inhabit that perspective as fully as possible. And Shane and her group, which is called 6 Degrees, what I want to do is make sure the reader is like coming into those chapters being like, oh, this seems like a bad idea, and coming out of them being like, she's right, of course we have to do this, right? And that's what fiction is. It's like, if you want the reader to believe it, you have to like find your own way to believing it, right? And I certainly think like that sort of ecotage, eco-saboteur, eco-terrorism, that sort of thread is becoming a lot more ever present in media, because the enormity of the crisis is finally sort of dawning on a lot of people. And so the impulse is to, of course, bypass the harder route of like using our democratic tools to change our economic system to address this issue, and to just start sort of indiscriminatorily
Yeah, sure.
without discrimination, bombing as much infrastructure as possible to make your point, right? And this has a long history, of course, which I don't have to like burden you with right now. But I think in the process of writing those chapters, even though I was maintaining my my fidelity to the character's beliefs, I absolutely became less and less convinced that is worth anything, right? And again, it's because you can't bomb your way to installing heat pumps in homes in Wisconsin, if that makes sense, right? Like the problem with the climate crisis is that it's not about stopping something as much as now it's about building something, and we have to find our way to doing that, and that requires a lot of top-down legislation and changes in policy. Well, how do we get that top-down legislation? Well, it requires the bottom-up movement. And so I think that's why in the course of the book, you see this grappling between these forces. But ultimately, it's sort of the elements that Kate Morris and her passion put in place that allows the world to have a fighting chance.
For sure. And you see the other side of that too in this book. For sure. The white nationalists coming up and the violence there. Again, as a reaction. You want to talk maybe a little bit about how that is still a reaction to the climate crisis? I mean, you touched on a little bit with the migratory.
What I said. I mean, if you look at sort of the migrant crisis happening in the U.S. now, this is like the perfect fodder. It's the absolute perfect fodder for a set of reactionary politics, and it's very important to resist that as full-throatedly as possible. But when you look at the projections of the numbers of people who are going to be on the move by the middle of the century, let alone by the end of the century, it is so staggering. It is just so overwhelming just to like see the numbers. And that's like, you're trying to even picture it, like what it would look like. And frankly, I spent a lot of time trying to picture what it would look like, and I still don't think it's necessarily possible. And so when you look at that, all you can say is, okay, we can't let that happen, because no matter how much compassion we build into our politics, human beings are human beings, and that's not going to go well. And so it's absolutely imperative we get a hold of this crisis for a number of reasons. But, the chain reaction that will lead to that reactionary politics is, I think, like top of the list.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Real light stuff. I know.
Take it to the beach, give it to grandma. It's going to be a fantastic Christmas present.
Yeah, I mean,
glad we're pubbing now.
Yeah, it's something I think of because we're, here on the Great Lakes, we're in the perfect landing zone. So it's going to be fascinating to see how this area builds up, or if we can sustain it too. I think about that a lot. Speaking of this area, the local connection, the book goes all over the country. There's lots happening in lots of places. My hometown, I think Parkersburg gets a shout out even in there at one point. Chemical production hub. Yay. But everyone loves a local connection. So there is a cabin in Wisconsin. How did that get placed in Wisconsin?
I literally was visiting a friend in Wisconsin at the time, and I was just sort of marveling at, I am probably all you think this too. Like, I think I took the train from Chicago up here, and I just spent the whole time looking out the window. Like, I think the Midwest is incredibly beautiful, even though it doesn't have that sort of reputation. But just sort of like watching that like low light, foggy mist like over the fields and the forests, and you're just like, ooh, it's like spooky and wonderful, right? And so in writing the book, I just like sort of plucked places I had been, occasionally a few I hadn't been, in order to create that like really like large sensation of our insane country, right? And I think I love writing about place. Like Ohio's so much about place. Like the fictional town in that is basically a character. And in this novel, the U.S. is a character. It is a part of the sort of fabric of the book. And so geographically, I just wanted to like keep it broad and keep it unexpected. And then I was like, okay, these people are meeting in some cabin randomly in the middle of nowhere. Where is it? And just was driving through Wisconsin, and I was like, that house right there, that's it.
That's the house. Yeah, absolutely. I love that about the book, by the way, how big the United States feels, like just physically big the United States feels, because you're everywhere in the country in this book. Even just the drive from Chicago out to Iowa and things like that. Yeah, that's really cool. Speaking of books, there is a book that kind of threads its way through this book, and I love that. Tony the Scientist has his book, One Last Stand, about the climate crisis.
One Last Chance. Yeah.
One Last Chance. Thank you. Can't write down anything, I tell you what. It's a big book. Anyway, One Last Chance. It's threaded through the story and it keeps appearing, even though it's sort of in the background. I think you can argue like the rest of the story doesn't happen without that book. So yeah, what about the power of books?
Well, yeah, I mean, the first section is called One Last Chance after Tony's book, right? And it sort of sets up this idea that like, oh, one last chance, that was a decade behind us, right? Which is sort of like a frightening framing device for the novel. But again, it's I like books, obviously grew up very much enjoying them. Still do. Reading a few right now, pretty nice. And yeah, I don't know. I think like sort of in our current information ecology where like I now sit on a plane and I'm just looking around and there's not a single person reading anything with paper. It's just everybody, and it's not just like reading something, it's like their little finger flicking to the next little like bullshit thing on their screen. And you're just like, you have this moment of just like, oh no, like first of all, I'm in the wrong business, and second of all, we're all gonna just be zombies now. Like it's like this is how we're intaking everything. And a while ago, I sort of changed my relationship to the internet. I got rid of Twitter, which was like the hellhole of my life for a while, and I didn't even realize it. And I stopped reading anything on the internet. Like I only read paper things, including newspapers now, which sounds crazy, but it's like I feel better all the time. Like my life feels better. I'm like less stressed out, and I just generally like have a better sort of grip on what's happening, even though I'm not like getting the information as quickly as everybody else. Does that make sense? Yeah. And like still to this day, like I don't feel like I understand a topic unless I've read a book about it. And I don't feel like I'm a healthy person if I haven't read a novel in a while. And so I just, try to make sure I'm doing that.
Totally.
Yeah.
I mean, we're in a bookstore, so I should ask, what are you reading or what have you read lately that you've loved? Anything?
Well, I this summer, because we were on strike, I had a lot of time to read.
Totally.
And I just like went through this tear where I was like, I'm going to read as many novels as possible. But the three that stand out were I did Ishiguro's Remains of the Day, which is like just this amazing novel. Fantastic. People know that, but
Sure.
I read Kafka on the Shore, So Weird, Wonderful. And then I read my good friend Curtis Sittenfeld's romantic comedy. And Curtis is just like a fantastic author. I always enjoy her novels. She's like, somebody once described her as Emily Bronte meets John Cheever of the contemporary literary scene. And I was like, that's amazing.
That's pretty great.
Yeah.
That's good.
So, that's been fantastic. And I just finished up a book on our like human relationship with the animals of North America. This book called Wild New World by Dan Flores, which is just fantastic, sort of describing we did real bad, but but with a little like hopeful angle on it at the end that I really appreciated.
Yeah, awesome. And I will second Kafka on the Shore. Weird, wonderful book. That's my like go-to. And in case anyone's wondering, that's my go-to as a bookseller. I haven't read Murakami. What should I read? Boom, that's the one. So there you go. Kafka on the Shore. I'll pull it for you when we're done. All right.
I think the Deluge would be a better pick just for the time being, but if you get two, then Kafka, that's also. Yeah.
It was assumed it was going to be
okay.
a second.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it's it's giving too much away to say the book has not what I'd call perhaps a happy ending, but maybe, depending on your outlook, a hopeful resolution in some ways. You touched on this a little bit in the face of the climate crisis and the state of the world. And what you said earlier makes me think maybe this isn't quite the right question, but I'll ask it anyway. What gives you some hope?
Yeah, no, I mean, I am more optimistic than I've been in a long, long time. I just think like watching.
It's getting off Twitter.
Well, yeah, for sure. Well, I just feel like in the process of writing this, I did myself a favor in terms of like my terror about the issue, which is that like now I definitely can see that small keyhole that we can squeeze through and come out the other side of this in a wildly better world, right? I there have been talking to this guy who came up with this term through Utopia. It's like, we don't want dystopia, obviously. Utopia is not on the menu right now. But we need to get through this. We need to get through this enormous, enormous challenge. And how can we do that in the most just, equitable, sustainable, and sort of joyful way, right? Like, how can we not just avert this crisis, but use this as an opportunity to change our relationship to the one and only home we will ever have, right? And so with that in mind, understanding that I have a limited reach of mostly, the 20 people who show up to my bookstore readings and, my single lifetime, what can I do with my preferred craft to advance any of that? And that has sort of given me at least the sort of the spiritual backstop to say like, okay, like it's not all going to be solved tomorrow, but like we have to do the work, and you have to go out and make sure you are advocating for that work as much as you can. And that is sort of, that's all one can do. And I think, just like going around the country for this book tour and talking to so many random people, I am like, no, like people get it and they're working their asses off. And, it's not that nobody's paying attention to this. A lot of people are paying attention to this. We're just all siloed in our own little like TikTok feeds, and we don't understand like, what everybody else is doing. And yeah, I don't know. And also, I'm from Ohio, and we just passed 2 wonderful bills for abortion rights and the legalization of cannabis.
Congrats on that.
And everybody like always makes fun of Ohio. It's turning into like some right-wing hellhole, but like I know a lot of people in Ohio who are awesome. And we were all on a text thread. I have like 6 of these text threads with people back home, and we were just like chatting it up yesterday, and I was just like, yeah, like it's this is all doable. And it's sort of about utilizing you're thinking about the climate crisis through the lens of not like the planet, but like your community, your family, your friends, the people you care about. That is why we are in this fight. Like, not to save some abstract thing, but to save the immediate people we care about and love.
I think that's the perfect note. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But before I do that, I'm gonna
Q&A.
I was gonna throw it out there. If anybody's got any questions, great.
Sure. Sure. Well, let me say something that I hope never gets picked up on the internet. Okay. um, I don't believe any of those people believe that. I really don't. I don't believe most of the Republicans in Congress I mean, there definitely are some who are like, for sure, sort of in their own siloed worldview. But trust me, most of those people, if you're a senator from Louisiana watching a football field of land vanish every like hour or whatever it is, this is happening. If you're in Alaska watching, whole communities fall into the sea, this is happening. All these people know this is happening, right? And I think what drives me a little nuts, and this is on the left as well, right, is that we're so wrapped up in making sure people believe what we believe and answer the questions the way we want them to answer that we forget that politics is all about incentives. So all of those people on that stage have been incentivized by the fossil fuel companies to answer that question in a fucking crazy way, right? What we have to do is change the incentives of those candidates. It's not going to happen overnight, and I'm not saying it's going to be easy. But one of the really crafty things the Inflation Reduction Act does is spreads out its investments across red states and red districts so that, you know, if someday soon you're a Republican congressperson and you do not have any oil and gas in your district, but you do have a battery factory and you do have a wind farm and you do have, a direct air capture plant, let's say, pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, and all the jobs in your community and all your campaign financing is coming from decarbonization, your incentives are going to change. Right. So that's point one. Point two is that how do we make that go faster? Because I agree right now it is absolutely not working fast enough. In terms of the Republican, the Republican, God, it's coming to Wisconsin, it's coming to Milwaukee. That's going to be so terrible. I'm so sorry. But I don't have any direct advice about it, but making sure the climate movement is heard from in that space of time. And I was somebody who thought, like, if the climate movement was brilliant, they would have ran a Republican candidate who believed in climate change, someone like Bob Inglis. And I don't agree with Bob Inglis. Bob Inglis is a congressman from South Carolina who got beat in the Tea Party election of 2010 because he was like, yeah, I believe in climate change. What, we don't? Okay. And basically, like Koch Industries came in and just like swamped him with money so that I forget the guy who beat him, but he's been going around very bravely and courageously talking to people who would not come to this book signing, right? Talking to people who absolutely do not believe in climate change and trying to make his case. And I just think, like, if the climate movement were smart, it would start moving into Republican politics and trying to find those candidates who they don't even have to win. They just have to speak truth to power, right? And so I would really like to see, like, our idea of how to change the politics of this evolve, and to begin looking at our political system and saying, okay, we can't let this go unanswered on one side of the aisle. And I know that sounds insane and absolutely unattainable, but it's what's going to have to happen if we're going to win this. We can't win this whole thing with 50+1 voting. I'll tell you that. Like, it's just going to be too difficult. And so, but at the same time, I know Wisconsin is in a really rough place with sort of gerrymandering and sort of the makeup of its state legislature. But like making sure that everybody keeps their nose in the business of local elections, like that's something that, like, so much of the action that we're going to need over the next decade is going to happen in cities like Milwaukee, and even just like looking at the money the IRA gives to schools, direct payments to schools to put solar panels on their roofs and begin, like looking to those little bits of our economic infrastructure and the geography of our states and our cities and our towns, and trying to figure out how to change that, which will create jobs, which will create more incentive for Republicans to sort of lose their grip on this insane notion that this isn't actually happening. Sorry, that's a super long-winded answer. You can tell I have a bit to say on all these subjects.
Couple thoughts on this. I love in the book too the sections that are so clearly focused on PR influence on all of these campaigns. Yeah, you do a wonderful job in the book. So yet another reason. So who else?
Yeah. I just learned it myself. So yeah. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, like, I don't think my novel is dystopian. So I keep seeing this word. It's in this book, in the blurbs, you know, it's like people keep saying that. And I'm like, I don't think you're right, dude. Like, you know, I'm so like, I don't know where that comes from because to me at least, it is an entirely realistic assessment of what's happening and where we're going. And the fact that things just keep coming true from the book only, you know, sort of cements my notion about that. I mean, to me, dystopia is easy, and you put it very well because it's sort of an easy narrative thing to drive narrative, right? And to me, the harder project of this was like, no, this is all the dystopian sort of shit that will be set in motion. How will people resist it? How will they fight against it? What will we turn to in order to turn this situation around? I think towards the end, I mean, I obviously wasn't going to shy away from like what I think is the really singular and appalling and sort of never before realized in the history of our species violence that is possible from this crisis. And I mean, and this is coming from somebody who loves history and understands there's been a lot of violence, right? Um, but I just think like when you look at the implications of what's happening, it is so terrifying. And if you do not show the reader how terrifying it could be, then you haven't accomplished the project. So to me, it was like finding that very careful, like middle ground between making sure the reader is understanding the potential for what could happen, but also not painting sort of this bleak dystopic, you know, one man protecting a girl in the forest from all these ravaging people with his shotgun and his karate or whatever the fuck we're all watching on TV all the time is. And I'm actually working on a possibly dystopic show right now. So that one's going to be good though. That one's going to be a banger. But yeah, I definitely think like to me, like dystopia is this weird thing. It's like, I call it like dystopian reverie where like, we're all so bothered by the world as it exists by like, the annoyance of our email and social media and everybody's bugging us all the time and the world seems like it's crazy that we all sort of like have this secret wish like maybe if everything just went away I could go plant beans on my own and just be chilling with my like two friends and my shotgun, you know. And I think that pervades all these shows and movies about is this sort of like anti-humanistic quality that like what we all actually want is for everybody to fuck off and die. And to me like that is something to absolutely be resisted. Is Oh, yes, 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 yes. I think it pervades the environmental left too. Yeah, absolutely. Which is that we've so despoiled the world that we all deserve to meet our maker, right? And that is just not a philosophy I can really get on board with. I like all the people. I think we're weird and fun. So, other questions? I really talked you guys out. You're like I didn't. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was a challenge. Like that was the challenge of the book. I am like an absolute vomiter of a writer. Like I just pour it out, right? And then at the end of it, I like get down on my hands and knees and start sifting through the vomit to see if there's like a novel in there, I guess. It's a very lovely analogy. You're welcome. I turned in a first draft that was 1,500 pages. I had edited that down myself from probably more than that. I thought, maybe I cut 100 pages and I was like very proud of myself. And my editor, Stuart, was just like, okay, this is phenomenal. Like he believed in the book so much, but he was like, you have to cut this down. Like you cannot publish it at this length just for, paper and glue costs alone. Um, but I think like I knew that in a certain way, and I just like had to figure out how to make the book move. What I wanted to do with it was make it gripping, make it a Stephen King page turner that you just happen to learn a hell of a lot about climate change from, right? And so that was the whole editing process, was figuring out how do I make this thing move like a freight train. So you get, the first chapter, like, what's going on? And then the second chapter, like, what the fuck are these boxes? And then by the third chapter, you're like, okay, I'm in. And then, by the middle of the book, you're just like hurtling through it, right? Like that was sort of my aim. And the whole editing process was about paring back and sometimes losing stuff I really liked And sometimes discovering the stuff that I really cared about was just molasses. It was just quicksand that as soon as the reader stepped into, it's sort of made the book lose all momentum. So yeah, editing for me is always the absolute most difficult part. Like the blank page thing is no problem. Like I sat down today and like blinked and wrote, however many words, and it's fine. But then I get to my writing and I'm just like, oh my God, like, did you have to include, everything about how advanced geothermal energy might work? Like, no, I don't think you did.
There's a lot though.
There's a lot. Yes. You're
great.
like, you should have cut more.
No, not at all. I mean, the freight train, that momentum is there, like mission accomplished, man. We got time for maybe one more quick one if someone's got one. Yes.
Well, I mean, what I've been doing is like sort of recommending like here's like the vision of how we get out of this. That's kind of like the thread I've been on. And I read all these books way more towards the end of it than the beginning. They're all more recent. I'll try to rattle a few off right now. Kendra Pierre Lewis wrote this book called Greenwash, which is really effective at sort of dismantling, I think, like the obsession with itty bitty consumer behavior as like a solution to anything. There's another one called Short Circuiting Policy by Leah Stokes, one of the architects of the IRA. And she talks a lot about how, weird, Texas has all these wind farms and like people don't really challenge them, but Ohio doesn't because and like the ways in which renewable energy has sprouted and flourished in places, even if they are red states, because it has the political momentum. Great book. The Big Fix by Hal Harvey and Justin Gillis is another great one. That's sort of like, how do we use democracy to turn this around? Which is like the only question that I'm really concerned about right now. And it's all these sort of like little levers in our economy that we actually have enormous power over. We just don't realize it. Another really important one is Electrify by Saul Griffith. This is basically the point that like, if we just electrified everything like we're planning to do, that would take care of 80% of our problem, 80% of our emissions problem. And so we should do that really fast and stop hand-wringing over like the 10 to 20% that's going to be harder. Because by the time we do the 80%, we will have the solutions to the 10 to 20%. So we should get started on this thing and quit worrying about airplane fuel just at this particular moment, right? And then the final one that I just think from sort of like a more philosophical perspective, the Buddhist monk and peace activist Thich Nhat Hanh died last year, a year and a half ago, maybe. And he left behind this last incredible, simple, short book called Zen and the Art of Saving the Planet. And this is a guy who was like friends with Martin Luther King Jr. Like his lifetime is incredible. It spans, a whole bunch of these causes. And I think that is just a spectacular book to remind us that like getting on Twitter and screaming at people is not an effective way of doing anything about this, right? And sort of bringing yourself back into your own like person as like a political agent, as an actor in history, as somebody who has agency and power, and remembering that like sometimes enormous social change takes slow, patient, relentless work. And I for me, that book really like sort of centered me and focused me on how I should be going out into the world, because I think I was like very nervous about coming out and talking about this book, because obviously it contains so much of these like very fraught ideas and all that. But I was like, you have to be able to talk about this thoughtfully and intelligently, or it's going to be a nightmare of a publication process. And so even if I like ramble on a lot and I don't always sound that thoughtful or intelligent and I make a lot of bad jokes, it still like gave me at least like the sort of insight into how my own mind works about this, and to just like talk about what we need to do and not sort of fling mud at everybody else, except for possibly the Republican convention that's going to be here. But other than that, sorry. Oh my God, I'm sorry. I couldn't help myself. I'm so sorry.
Forgiven. Stephen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been absolutely great. Thank you all for being here.